Now, there are weaknesses in that particular procedure. It's possible, for example, that a pilot misidentifies another aircraft and thinks they've seen the one when in fact they haven't. It's possible they misidentify other celestial objects, whether aircraft or stars or planets even, we've seen in the past, and that can be problematic.
So we will, of course, be bringing you the very latest from Washington, where the mid-air plane crash has left dozens dead and where we are still waiting for answers about what led to this collision. There's just been a press conference where we have had some information about that. And we've got, actually, we'll talk now to our next guest on this topic, because we don't yet know exactly what went wrong. But what we do know is that the FBI has said there's no evidence of criminality. Air traffic control asked the helicopter if they had the jet in sight, but then told the helicopter to pass behind it. Seconds later, they crashed. So let's bring in Tim Atkinson, who's an air accident investigator and aviation consultant now. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I think what many listeners will be wondering is how it was possible that this could happen.
Well, it's a great question. The way that safety is achieved in aviation is by a layered approach, and there are various strategies and tactics and procedures and bits of technical equipment and so forth, which ensure that collisions don't occur unless there are multiple breaches of those things. What we seem to be seeing here is a cocktail of circumstances which begins with the air traffic controller using what's called reduced separation, and that's where aircraft are allowed to get closer to each other than they normally would be, on the basis that in this case the helicopter pilot or pilots reported they had the other aircraft in sight and therefore they'd avoid it. Now, there are weaknesses in that particular procedure. It's possible, for example, that a pilot misidentifies another aircraft and thinks they've seen the one when in fact they haven't. It's possible they misidentify other celestial objects, whether aircraft or stars or planets even, we've seen in the past, and that can be problematic. And with the two aircraft approaching each other then without that visual contact, and another possibility I should say is that the pilots report they see the other aircraft and then they lose sight of it. You're left with the two aircraft approaching, and a system at that point would normally activate a system called TCAS, which warns pilots of the presence of other aircraft and in most cases issues instructions for them to manoeuvre so that they avoid a collision. But of course, around an airport and close into an airport, there are many aircraft. And for that reason, that system is partly disabled when you're close to an airport at low altitude, and therefore it doesn't issue those same warnings. And I expect that the investigation will identify those factors as being the critical ones here.
Right, so quite a combination of different things that seem to go wrong at any given time. Presumably one of the reasons why they were permitted to be in such close contact was because there is such demand for flights in this airspace. It's quite a complex airspace, isn't it? Can you just talk us through what has made this a particularly difficult place for pilots to be flying?
Well, any major airport and any conurbation which has one or more than one airports is going to have relatively busy airspace. But with Washington being the political centre that it is in the US, and there are all kinds of agencies and so forth there, all of which, of course, have quite complex travel demands on the airspace around them. Helicopters are incredible enablers of travel, and the US military and commercial corporations and so on use them fairly extensively. It's integrating those rotary wing helicopter operations with airline operations, which can be challenging. I believe in this case that there are some routes laid down for helicopters to follow. That's quite a routine way of doing things, and those routes generally are deconflicted from the approach paths to an airport. And again, I'm sure that investigators will be looking at those aspects.
And just talk us through how rare this is. So it's the first major US commercial aircraft incident in 16 years, but it does feel like there have been a number of near misses, doesn't it?
Well, there have, and in recent weeks, I dare say that aviation globally has suffered a bad patch. Now, we used to say as investigators that randomness comes in clumps. Events don't come at regular intervals, and I'd expect that we'll look back on this period as being abnormal. Mid-air collisions are very rare involving airliners. They're relatively common involving light leisure aircraft. One every few years in the United Kingdom, in my experience. But the things that come together in light aircraft mid-air collisions, which are more common, are of a different nature to that which we see here. Civil aviation is a great enabler for business and leisure and commerce. It is not a zero harm activity. It comes at a degree of risk which is extremely slight, but nonetheless, in the enormous amount of aviation that goes on, the huge numbers of flights every day, we do from time to time see tragic events such as these.
Yeah, and on the case of the Ronald Reagan Airport, do we know, clearly they've halted all flights from that. It's going to cause a huge amount of disruption. Do we know anything more about that now?
No, I don't. It would be very normal for an airport to close in these circumstances for a number of reasons, not least that the capacity to deal with another emergency will be significantly depleted. And I'm sure that there is a quick review going on to see whether there are any immediate changes which should be made. I wouldn't imagine that review will find anything. What I think we see here is an unusual set of circumstances which has come together in the worst possible way. It would be possible, for example, for America to decide in the aftermath of this event not to use that kind of separation where one pilot reports they can see the other. But that would be enormously detrimental to the efficiency of air travel, and it would cause significant delays.
Yeah, certainly trade-offs there. Well, thank you very much for talking us through that. That was Tim Atkinson, an air accident investigator and aviation consultant. And we'll now go back live to Washington, D.C., where Caitlin Dornbos is there for the New York Post. Hi, Caitlin.
Hello, thank you.
So can you just update us on the latest? So more than 30 are believed to be dead now. What else do we know?
Yeah, the airport has been closed since it happened, and it will continue to be closed for another 3 hours. We've got 67 bodies in total. At least 30 are still in the water. Rescue operations or recovery operations now have been ongoing since last night when this happened, about 8:39 p.m. Eastern time, and it's a horrible situation. I can't help but I take that same flight all of the time, and it's terrible this has happened.
And you're actually from the city in Kansas where the flight took off, and this flight path is very new, isn't it?
Yes. So we had been, I'm from Kansas originally, and people in central Kansas had been so excited to get a flight to the East Coast. Wichita, Kansas is a very small town. Well, it's a small city, and there's probably 500,000 people within the greater metropolitan area. Not very many, though, in general. And usually you have to go 3-4 hours to find an airport. So they just got this flight in January of last year after a lot of tension and trying to convince more convince more planes to get into that airport. And now there's a concern possibly that there is too much air traffic at this airport.
And there's been a press briefing in the last few minutes. Can you just update us on what we learned from that in particular?
Yeah, we learned our numbers from there. The 67 is just what came out now, and it's just a terrible number. We should know that the family members aren't all aware yet. They're still being notified. So it has been a long night for a lot of families in Kansas.
And so much of the search and rescue operation has been in darkness. Can you just talk to us about the conditions of that? It's been murky, it's been cold, it's not been an easy operation for those who are seeking to find bodies and rescue those who might have survived.
Right. No, it has not been easy at all. It was about 35 degrees in the water last night. So if that gives you an idea of how cold it was for those divers to go down, that's probably also partially why they are still recovering bodies just because of the intense conditions of that water. It's the middle of winter here, and those waters are so frigid that it would kill anyone almost immediately.
And is there any hope? Was there any hope expressed by those in that press conference that there are any survivors among those who were involved in this crash?
There are no survivors.
So they've confirmed that now, that there are no survivors.
Survivors.
Okay, well, that is, a truly tragic development. And of course, we will bring you more on this. But thank you very much for talking us through that, Caitlin Donbass, who is in Washington, D.C. for the New York Post and was listening to that press conference about that awful collision.